Chapter 3, Transport of Oxygen and Carbon Dioxide and the Overall Regulation of Ventilation. Let's talk about the transport of oxygen. Just as a reminder, we did this earlier when we did the Fick equation. Oxygen content is the total amount of oxygen in the blood. It's most likely going to be given in volume percent. So 20 volume percent means 20 mils of oxygen per 100 mil of blood. And we converted that to 0.2 mils of oxygen per mil of blood when we did the Fick calculation. So just a quick reminder, O2 content will be given in volume percent, which means per 100 mil. Two different ways we carry oxygen. One is dissolved, and that's the relationship shown here. The PO2 represents dissolved oxygen. So the first thing oxygen does is, moving from the alveolus, it dissolves into the liquid and moves into the plasma phase of the blood. So the plasma compartment. So PO2 represents the pressure exerted by the dissolved gas. That's what PO2 represents. So as PO2 goes up, then clearly there's a direct relationship to the amount of oxygen that is dissolved. So the dissolved oxygen is the partial pressure, and that's one way we transport oxygen. The second way is bound to hemoglobin. So oxygen binds to hemoglobin. Oxygen content is the sum of the two. So it is dissolved plus what's bound to hemoglobin. And the abbreviation for this is capital C for content, and if it's arterial blood, it'll be a small a for arterial. If it's venous blood, then it will be a small v for venous blood. So CaO2 means oxygen content of arterial blood. Below is a kind of a table that shows that the amount dissolved is not very much. At a PO2 of 100, we have very little dissolved. But notice we have a lot bound to hemoglobin. The amount bound to hemoglobin is approximately 19.4 volume percent. But the two together is total oxygen content. So oxygen content is the sum of what's dissolved plus what's bound to hemoglobin. But clearly the major player here is what's bound to hemoglobin. If I hyperventilate and drive up PO2 to 130, I'll increase the dissolved a little because PO2 went up. I have more dissolved, thus exerting a greater pressure. But I'm not really going to change oxygen content because notice I didn't put any more oxygen on the hemoglobin molecule. The hemoglobin molecule, it's in the red blood cell. That's my little red truck. So I didn't put any more on the truck because we're pretty much saturated at that PO2, as we will describe when we talk about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve on the next slide. All right, here's our oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Notice first the x-axis. All right, the x-axis is PO2. This is the amount dissolved. One of the ways I like to think about oxygen transport is, okay, we have an alveolus that has a lot of oxygen. That's like a warehouse. And I want to put it on my truck, hemoglobin, my little red truck, hemoglobin. But before I can do that, I have to put it on the loading zone. So the plasma represents the loading zone. The PO2 is the pressure exerted by the dissolved gas. So that's telling me how much I have on my loading zone. Notice, as I get more onto the loading zone, that means I can load more onto my little red truck. At a PO2 of 100, we're pretty close to fully saturating the hemoglobin molecule. And that's why in the previous slide, increasing PO2 really didn't have a big impact on oxygen content. Again, oxygen content's the total amount. My truck's pretty full. Now, technically, there are 4 little binding sites on my truck, and that's what the 2, 3, and the 4 represent. The 1 is left off because just for clarity. So at a high PO2, all the binding sites, i.e. my truck, is pretty darn full. But it's a sigmoidal curve showing cooperative binding we learned in biochemistry. So as PO2 falls, I have less and less on the loading zone. I'm going to have less on the truck. So the way to think about it is I try to load the truck at the alveolus because that's my warehouse, so that's where I get a high PO2. So I put a lot on the loading zone and I fill up my truck. When I go to the tissues, it's going to come out of the loading zone into the tissue because the tissue needs the oxygen. As I decrease it on the loading zone, I can unload it from the truck. And that's what points 3 and 2 represent, is an unloading of the truck because I've reduced what's on the loading zone. So at the tissue, we can dump off the oxygen from the truck because we're reducing the amount in the loading zone. Next important aspect of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is illustrated on this slide. This is what's called the P50. The P50 is the PO2 at which I have 50% saturation. So 2 of the 4 binding sites are holding oxygen. So it's 50% saturated. So again, P50 is the PO2 at which I have 50% saturation. My truck is half full. All right, why is P50 so important? Because P50 describes the overall affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. The P50 describes the overall affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. If the P50 goes up, this will mean reduced affinity. This favors unloading. If the P50 goes down, this means increased affinity. This favors loading. All right, how can we help to try to remember P50? Well, think about your dose-response curves in pharmacology. And you have what's called an ED50, effective dose generating 50% response. Well, P50 will be very similar. Now, the ED50 defines potency of a drug. Hopefully you can recall that if you increase the ED50, then the drug is less potent. That's a right shift in a dose-response curve. You get the exact same thing here. An increase in P50 means a right shift and reduced affinity. And if I have reduced affinity, hopefully it makes sense to you that this is going to favor unloading the truck. If a drug has a low ED50, if the ED50 were to go down, then that would mean a more potent drug. It takes less drug to produce 50% response. Same story for the P50. If I have a lower P50, that's a left shift in the curve, that means there's a greater affinity. So I'll be 50% saturated at a lower PO2. This, of course, will favor loading because high affinity means I'm going to snatch on, my little red truck is going to snatch on to that oxygen. Factors that are going to alter the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve are temperature, PCO2, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, BPG, and hydrogen ion. If they increase, I get a right shift in the curve. If they decrease, I get a left shift in the curve. Now, notice the P50s. If I increase these variables, the P50 goes up. An increased P50 means less affinity. So a right shift in the curve means increased P50, which means decreased affinity. So a rise in temperature or CO2 or hydrogen ion, like during exercise, right shifts the curve, which increases the P50 and reduces the affinity, which is very, very beneficial because that helps unload the oxygen to the tissue. A left shift in the curve, so if these go down, temperature goes down, etc., then we left shift the curve and we decrease the P50, which means we have greater affinity. So blood that's been stored in a blood bank for a long period of time tends to lose its BPG, And as a result, we get a left shift in the curve, low P50, and it doesn't want to give up the oxygen as easily. Think about fetal hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin has, which would it be, a lower or higher P50 than an adult? Yeah, fetal hemoglobin has a much higher affinity than adult hemoglobin, which means it has a much lower P50. So these are the ones to key in on that shift the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Here's a slide just reiterating what we just said. A shift to the right means increased P50, reduced affinity. Therefore, it's easier for the tissues to extract the oxygen, like in exercise. Shift to the left, more difficult for the tissue to get oxygen. Steep part of the curve, O2 content is decreased if I right shift the curve. Let's stop and think about that for a second. If I increase the P50, right shift the curve, that means when I'm on the steep part of the curve, for any given PO2, I'm going to have less bound to hemoglobin. If I left shift the curve, I'm going to have more bound to hemoglobin because I have greater affinity. So if I right shift the curve, oxygen content is going to go down because I have less bound to hemoglobin. If I left shift the curve, higher affinity, I have more bound to hemoglobin, I have a higher oxygen content. All right, so right shift, P50 increase, decreased affinity. You're saying the same thing. Left shift, decreased P50, increased affinity. You're saying the same thing. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, blood after it's been stored loses its 2,3-BPG. That causes a left shift, lower P50. Blood doesn't want to give up the oxygen. Also, fetal hemoglobin causes a big shift to the left, much lower P50 than adult. All right, factors to look for on step 1 related to oxygen transport will be the amount of hemoglobin. In the purple, that's our normal scenario. In the green, we have polycythemia. And in the blue, we have anemia. Polycythemia is an increase in red cells, so more red trucks. The blue is anemia, which means reduced hematocrit, which means less red trucks. Notice the oxygen content is going to go up in polycythemia, down in anemia. Now, the P50 doesn't really change because all we've done is add trucks or taken away trucks. There is the potential that anemia could change things metabolically, and that's true, and then the P50 would change. But if all I do is change the number of trucks, I'm not changing the affinity, I'm just changing the number of trucks. So P50 stays the same. I'm not doing anything by adding more trucks or taking away trucks. I'm not hindering the ability of oxygen to go from the alveolus to the plasma. So I can take it from the warehouse and put it on the loading zone. So all of these are going to show a normal arterial PO2. All right, some pathology integration. Remember, anemia means reduced viscosity, which increases the Reynolds number. This means we have increased potential for turbulent flow. Where do we most likely to have turbulent flow? Well, big diameter, high velocity, that is the aorta. And turbulence creates a bruit. Turbulence increases resistance. If I have polycythemia, I'm increasing viscosity, which increases the resistance. Yes, I have more red trucks to carry oxygen, but now I have elevated resistance, so it's kind of a trade-off. An important factoid to remember is high altitude will stimulate red cell production. So at high altitude, you will get a relative polycythemia. Second big player for step 1 with respect to oxygen transport will be carbon monoxide. Yeah, hemoglobin just loves carbon monoxide. I mean, boy, do they hug. Hemoglobin and carbon monoxide hug and hug tightly. There's a much, much greater affinity. Hemoglobin has a much greater affinity for carbon monoxide than it does for oxygen. So if I start putting carbon monoxide into the system, notice that hemoglobin oxygen content goes down. So this is going to reduce arterial oxygen content. PO2 will be normal, and also your sat meter, your O2 sat meter will be normal, because the O2 sat meter can't tell the difference between carbon monoxide and oxygen. It's just looking at the color. Okay, if you think about it, the hemoglobin is saturated, it's just not saturated with oxygen. When carbon monoxide binds to it, the blood stays nice and red, nice and red. Oxygen binding to hemoglobin is what turns it red. Carbon monoxide keeps it nice and red. So the O2 sat meter can't detect carbon monoxide poisoning because it will look normal on the O2 sat meter. Now, notice that the P50 actually goes down, which means the oxygen that is bound is held more tightly. This is a double whammy to the tissues if you think about it. Oxygen content is down, robbing the tissues of their grocery, oxygen. And in addition, when the truck's coming by to drop off the oxygen, it doesn't want to give it up. So it's a double whammy to the tissue. Carbon monoxide is a very deadly gas. Carbon monoxide can also disrupt the electron transport system as well. So very deadly gas. All right, this is a table reiterating what we just said. If we start with anemia, we have a low oxygen content because we have a low hemoglobin concentration. The hemoglobin is saturated, so O2 sat will be fine, but the arterial oxygen content is depressed. PO2 will be normal, as we indicated. In polycythemia, arterial oxygen content goes up. And the reason it goes up is because hemoglobin concentration goes up. The O2 sat meter will be normal. PO2 will be normal. We just have more red trucks. Finally, in carbon monoxide poisoning, arterial PO2 will be normal, but O2 content will go down. And that's not because I have less hemoglobin. I just have less hemoglobin binding the oxygen. So the oxygen per gram of hemoglobin is down. The truck is still full, but it's not full of oxygen. There's something else on board. There's carbon monoxide on board. So that's why oxygen content goes down. Now remember, venous PO2 is going to go down in carbon monoxide poisoning because we have a decrease in oxygen content. That's going to reduce delivery. As we discussed in the cardiovascular section, if I reduce delivery of oxygen, venous oxygen will go down. So venous PO2 will tend to go down in carbon monoxide poisoning. Same is true for anemia, and that's just presuming if blood flow were to stay constant, then delivery would go down, which means venous oxygen goes down. Apply that Fick principle we discussed in cardiovascular. Interpret, infer, based upon venous PO2. All right, for the transport of carbon dioxide, this is really not overly complicated. Again, CO2, man, is it soluble. It is very soluble. Carbon dioxide will react with terminal amine groups to form what we call carbamino compounds, and about 5% of CO2 is carried as carbamino compounds. This binding to hemoglobin by CO2 is not the same site as oxygen. Now, this is a very minor aspect, but it will bind to proteins. And what's the most abundant protein in whole blood? Oh yeah, in whole blood it's hemoglobin. In plasma it's albumin. But in whole blood it's hemoglobin. So CO2 will bind to that a little. This is a very minor component though, very minor. The primary way CO2 is transported is as bicarbonate. Notice the chemical reaction that we have in this red blood cell. CO2 comes from the tissue, dissolves into the erythrocyte. Man, is that CO2 soluble. Combines with water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase to generate hydrogen and bicarb. All right, CO2 is an acid because it generates hydrogen. We know we're at the tissue level because CO2 is moving into the plasma. That occurs at the tissue level. Now, this hydrogen can bind up to proteins. Again, the most abundant protein in whole blood is hemoglobin. And the bicarb will diffuse out of the cell into the plasma. Now, if you look at that chemical reaction, starting with CO2 and water on the left, generating hydrogen and bicarb. And if we think about our basic chemistry, if I'm taking away the product, hydrogen's binding up, bicarb's leaving the cell. If I take away the products of a chemical reaction, then that's just going to keep driving the reaction. So this CO2 is just going to be driven to bicarb. And 70 to 90% of CO2 is transported as bicarb. This is the big player. Now, this is a negative charge leaving. So we have to replace it with a negative charge. Who comes to the rescue? Chloride. So chloride will move into the cell at the tissue level to balance the charge created by the negative bicarb leaving. So the bicarb leaves, chloride comes in. This is referred to as the chloride shift. So notice at the tissue level, chloride's going to move into the red blood cell. Now if you think about it, what's going to happen at the lungs? We're just going to reverse everything. CO2 is going to move out of the plasma and go into the alveolus. So we're going to take this chemical reaction and drive it back to the left. And we'll keep driving it to the left because the CO2 will leave the red blood cell, go to the plasma, go to the alveolus. So bicarb will come back into the cell. And to maintain electroneutrality, the chloride will move out. Hydrogen and bicarb will bind together to form CO2 and will drive the reaction to the left to make CO2 because we're always pulling that CO2 off as it goes into the alveolus. So one of the things to appreciate on the STEP exam, in addition to the idea that the major way CO2 is transported as bicarb, is this chloride shift in and out of the red blood cell. Know that it goes in at the tissue and out at the lungs. And if you just think about the basic chemical reaction and where we're generating bicarb or where we're consuming bicarb, we know that chloride's going to go in the opposite direction. Okay, let's talk now about the control of ventilation. We're going to have chemoreceptors in the brain called central chemoreceptors, and in the peripheral vasculature we'll call peripheral or arterial chemoreceptors. As their name implies, they are responsive to chemicals, chemoreceptors. So here we are with a picture of them in the medulla. So there are my central chemoreceptors located in the medulla, and stimulation of these central chemoreceptors stimulates ventilation. All right, what's going to stimulate them? CO2 and hydrogen in the brain. So if CO2 or hydrogen go up in the brain, it stimulates ventilation. Hopefully you can appreciate this as a beautiful negative feedback system. A beautiful negative feedback system. If CO2 goes up, we want to increase ventilation to blow it off to bring it back down. If hydrogen goes up, I want to blow off CO2. I want to blow off CO2 because CO2 is an acid. Remember, it generates hydrogen. All right, we can't forget that we have a blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is not a barrier for CO2. Notice that if arterial CO2 goes up, it will cross the blood-brain barrier, enter into the medulla, and stimulate ventilation. The most likely scenario is that CO2 going up generates hydrogen, and it's ultimately the hydrogen that stimulates medullary chemoreceptors or central chemoreceptors. But that's okay if we just remember it as, hey, a rise in CO2 stimulates. Whether or not the final one is hydrogen is not of great importance. But the big point here is that a rise in arterial CO2 will stimulate central chemoreceptors because it easily crosses. Contrast that with a rise in hydrogen. Notice that we don't easily cross the blood-brain barrier. This hydrogen ion is not going to readily cross the blood-brain barrier. So if blood hydrogen goes up, it's not, at least acutely, it's not going to stimulate medullary chemoreceptors. A rise in CO2 will, but not a rise in hydrogen. Boy, is that CO2 important for controlling ventilation. You live on a CO2 drive to breathe. Now, these central chemoreceptors will adapt to chronic changes. Our COPD patients are classic for retaining CO2, and their central chemoreceptors adapt to this chronic elevation in CO2. Another very high yield point for step 1, these are not responsive to oxygen. So central chemoreceptors are only responding to CO2 and hydrogen. As I alluded to on the previous slide, we also have chemoreceptors monitoring the blood. We call these peripheral chemoreceptors, sometimes called arterial chemoreceptors. They are found in carotid bodies and aortic bodies. They are near our baroreceptors found in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Carotid bodies, aortic bodies, baroreceptors, they're just neighbors. They're just like next door neighbors. So hopefully it makes sense that carotid bodies are going to send their input to the medulla via cranial nerve 9, just like carotid sinus baroreceptors did. Again, cranial nerve 9 is glossopharyngeal. And aortic bodies, since they're near the aortic baroreceptors, will send their afferents to the brain via the vagus, cranial nerve 10. All right, peripheral chemoreceptors are monitoring arterial blood. They have receptors for hydrogen and CO2. They're not as big a player in the steady state response, but you should recognize they respond to hydrogen ion and CO2. They also respond to oxygen. So they're going to monitor blood PCO2, blood hydrogen, and blood PO2. Now notice this is PO2. This is loading zone. This is the oxygen dissolved in the plasma. This is not oxygen content. So anemia is not a stimulus for breathing because PO2 is normal. All right, it is the partial pressure of oxygen. So they are stimulated by a reduction in arterial PO2. Again, negative feedback. If arterial PO2 is falling, then it stimulates peripheral chemoreceptors to increase ventilation to try to increase arterial PO2. So negative feedback, and it makes good sense. Okay? So these will respond to hypoxemia or hypoxia, low arterial PO2, particularly if we have CO2 retention. The bottom line, we are monitoring oxygenation of the blood with peripheral chemoreceptors. Again, they respond to a drop in arterial PO2. They also respond to hydrogen and CO2. As we've indicated several times, remember that all muscles of ventilation are skeletal muscle, which means I must get a discharge in an alpha motor neuron in order to get them to contract. What fires those alpha motor neurons? Well, medullary descending fibers. So in the medulla, we have our rhythm generator that's going to tell the motor neurons at the level of the diaphragm, external intercostals, etc., to drive ventilation. Again, remember, cranial nerves 9 and 10 come in to the medulla. My central chemoreceptors are in the medulla. So this is how we regulate ventilation. And we can have ventilation without even thinking about it, even though it's an alpha motor neuron, right? We don't have to wake up every 10 seconds and remind ourselves to breathe. It will just occur on a regular rhythm. And that's because of this system. All right, for step 1, big thing to remember is where the alpha motor neurons come out innervating the diaphragm. In other words, the phrenic nerve. They come out between C3 and C5. So if I get a C1, C2 transection, the medulla can no longer talk to the alpha motor neurons in the phrenic. And so a patient can't breathe spontaneously. If I get a lower transsection, say C6, well, this will preserve the medullary phrenic communication. And so the patient can do just fine because they still have innervation of the diaphragm, so they can still breathe on their own. The intercostals, remember our external intercostals, where our other muscles associated with inspiration. The external intercostals come out in the thoracic region, so any kind of cervical lesion, we will lose input to the intercostals. So the big thing there is phrenic is coming out between C3 and C5. Think about spinal cord injury and the ability to breathe on your own. All right, let's talk just a bit about some abnormal breathing patterns. The first we call apneustic breathing. These are prolonged inspirations followed by a short period of expiration. This is thought to be due to the loss of balance between the vagal inputs and the interplay between the pons and the medulla. Again, the medulla is our rhythm generator, but it does receive input from the pons and also from the vagus. So this disruption. So the thing to think about if you get an apneustic breathing pattern on step 1 is think about pontine damage. Think about pontine damage, particularly in the caudal pons. The second is called Cheyne-Stokes breathing. If you've ever seen this, this is not a breathing pattern that's very comfortable to watch. There are periodic breathing cycles between increased and decreased depths and frequency. All right, so what does that mean? That means that the patient will breathe something like this. They'll go so I'm increasing the volume and frequency up to a point, and then it begins to decrease in intensity and thus volume. Now, that breathing pattern will be separated by periods of apnea. So they'll do that breathing pattern and then not breathe for a while. Apnea means lack of breathing. And then that breathing pattern and then apnea for a while. Again, it is not an enjoyable thing to watch. It is very difficult to watch that kind of breathing pattern. Things to think about on step 1 if you get Cheyne-Stokes in a clinical vignette is midbrain lesion or congestive heart failure patients. Congestive heart failure patients, particularly when they're asleep, can exhibit this Cheyne-Stokes breathing pattern. All right, now we're going to stress the respiratory system. Okay, we're going to put in a fundamental stress. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something a little bit different than your book. I'm going to restructure the text a little bit and talk about it a little bit differently. What I like to do is take the fundamental stress or fundamental pathology, okay, define it, and then just think my way from there. Just think my way from there. What I'm doing by defining the fundamental stress or pathology is effectively I am defining the horse, and then everything follows the horse. And I find this a very, very powerful way to reinforce principles, my understanding of principles, and I can figure things out. We're not trying to memorize. We're just going to work with material that we understand. For high altitude, the stress is a decrease in total pressure. So I know if total pressure goes down, then inspired PO2 goes down. That's my alveolar air equation. Well, if inspired PO2 goes down, then alveolar PO2 will go down. And this will cause hypoxemia, a low arterial PO2. Well, a low arterial PO2 stimulates peripheral chemoreceptors, which is going to decrease arterial PCO2. So I'm defining the horse and then just working my way through it. A low arterial PCO2 means a respiratory alkalosis. PCO2 is an acid. All right? A respiratory alkalosis can result in acute mountain sickness, which is a feeling of dysphoria. You feel, you're nauseated. It's just not a pleasant experience and can ultimately progress to cerebral edema, and thus can be quite a problem clinically. A low arterial PO2 means I'm going to come down the oxyhemoglobin saturation curve. By decreasing the percent saturation of hemoglobin, I know oxygen content is going to go down. So again, I'm defining the fundamental stress, and then I just walk my way through it. Now, to acclimate to high altitude, well, I can't acclimate a low PO2 and the subsequent low PCO2 due to hyperventilation. We can't change atmospheric pressure. But now, looking and defining what the fundamental problem is, I can pretty much figure out what the body's going to do. I have a respiratory alkalosis. I have an alkalosis, so I know what the kidneys are going to do is decrease bicarbonate reabsorption to resolve the alkalosis. That's what the kidney's job is. It's going to take care of the alkalosis by dumping bicarb. I have low oxygen content because I can't fill my truck up. So what am I going to do? Increase the number of trucks. High altitude will stimulate the production of erythropoietin to increase the number of red blood cells to try to alleviate my low oxygen content. I can't fill the trucks with more oxygen because that's my problem. I have a low amount on the loading zone, low PO2, and I can't fix that. So what do? I just make more trucks to resolve the low oxygen content. They may not be as full, but I have more of them, so the content gets restored. Now, one of the downsides here is, remember that low alveolar PO2 is going to stimulate hypoxic vasoconstriction in the pulmonary circulation. So now my pulmonary vasculature is going to constrict, the arterioles, hypoxic vasoconstriction. I have polycythemia, which means elevated resistance. So combined, these can cause pulmonary hypertension. And we can develop what's called cor pulmonale, which is right ventricular failure secondary to pulmonary hypertension. So again, now you've got most of this text, virtually all of this text in your book, but I just do it a little bit differently. I just want to work with it. I want to define the fundamental stress, and you can do this with so many things. Define the fundamental dysfunction of a pathology. You know, what's being altered? Same thing with a drug. And then we just work our way from there, utilizing this understanding of physiology that we have. I consider this a very powerful way to study. I'm going to do the same thing, only now, instead of a low pressure, we're going to go to a high pressure environment. Well, if total pressure goes up, that means inspired PO2 goes up. That means alveolar PO2 goes up. Well, that's not good. Too much oxygen is toxic. I don't care what they say in Hollywood. Taking too much oxygen is toxic. You probably learned that in biochemistry, maybe also some in microbiology. Generation of free radicals, oxygen-free radicals can damage tissue, and so we get oxygen toxicity. That's what occurs in a high-pressure environment, a hyperbaric condition. We do have clinical uses for this, though, and that's part of the reason that we're going to bring this in for step one. It's not just about the physiology of stress in the system. We also have this for clinical. This is utilized for carbon monoxide poisoning, gas gangrene, and compromised tissue grafts. Let's do a little bridge to some bugs. Microbiology. Hopefully you remember Clostridium perfringens. Yeah, that's an anaerobe, and so we utilize hyperbaric conditions because of this bug. And also, we do have some aerobes that can sometimes be treated effectively by increasing oxygen, and that's staph and vibrio. Staph and vibrio. Those two are aerobes, but they're still shown clinical promise by going into high pressure condition, because we get a little bit better blood flow, a little bit better delivery of oxygen, etc., and so we're able to heal a little bit better. Now, we don't typically think a lot about nitrogen, but when we go to a high pressure environment, now that nitrogen is going way, way up. And one of the dangers of high nitrogen is something called rupture of the deep. High pressure environment is like diving into great depths, and this can generate what we call rupture of the deep. Now, this has been equated to having 2 martinis. It's a euphoria. It's a euphoria, like with 2 martinis. I'm not much of a martini drinker, so maybe 3 glasses of wine or 3 or 4 beers. That kind of euphoria. Yeah. Now, the downside of that is you're going to get this when you're many, many, many meters underwater, and you don't want to make a mistake down there. So rupture of the deep may be euphoria, but it's not a good idea because you don't want to make any mistakes down there. And sometimes we make mistakes after a couple of martinis or 3 or 4 glasses of wine or 3 or 4 beers. Yeah, so that's a dangerous scenario. In addition, this nitrogen gets pushed into tissues, into joints, and if we depressurize, okay, go to a lower pressure too quickly, this nitrogen can come out of solution in the joints. We call that the Benz, Cason's disease. But it can also come out of solution in the blood, forming air emboli. So, even though we do have some clinical uses of it, this is a stress to the system, and we need to appreciate factors that are going to be influenced when I stress the system by going to a high pressure environment.